We've all been there, that moment when you get to mission 25, you have at least one spy on your team, you walk up to the nearest legend and politely ask him for his shockwave.
Do it!
He refuses, so you decide to sneak a hand into his pocket and steal it for yourself, and in that moment you hold infinite power. The power to fart so hard that you can blast pigs hundreds of feet into the air. Simply wonderful. The shockwave is one of, if not the rarest weapons in the entire game. It is only available to the Legend class in single player, however it can also be found in special crates on Square Off in multiplayer, which is oddly specific. This is the general knowledge that the majority of the community already know about this weapon, so what more is there to learn? Well, for starters, let's take a look at the two categories this weapon can be split into: damage and knockback. Each weapon in Hogs will have a high focus on dealing more, less, or a mixture of both of these elements. In this case, the shockwave would sit in the knockback category, considering that it only deals between 10 to 13 damage when at the closest range possible. Other weapons will differ greatly. For instance, the rifle and pistol are entirely damage based with very little to no knockback, while the cattle prod is all about pushing pigs a long way in a particular direction. But we also must not forget the shockwave's crazy distant cousin, the shock shell, which can only be found within the arsenal of any given artillery. It works in exactly the same way as the shockwave ability, using heavy knockback to blast pigs away. Contact with this shell won't blast you as high or far as the shockwave, but it will deal slightly more damage, between 15 to 20 HP's worth. So what about the history of this weapon? Well, back in the prehistoric era of Hogs' development, the shockwave was once again held by the Legend class of pig. Only this time, the Legend was both accessible and playable to the player. However, there are two things to note about the weapon here. The first being how this weapon was supposedly operated. When drawn by the player, the shockwave was used in the same way as a grenade would be, with the player being able to hold down the X button in order to increase the power of their throw. No throwing animation actually plays here though, which actually shows that this weapon, like most of the weapons in this version of the game, hadn't actually been implemented yet. The game did actually have throwing animations for grenades and other items like poison gas, so if the shockwave did happen to be a form of grenade, then it would have been used here. Ultimately, the devs just wanted it to look like it had some kind of functionality, as selecting a weapon and then pressing a button and nothing happening doesn't exactly fill you with any kind of confidence. What initially piqued my interest about the shockwave being a type of grenade was the mention of the concussion grenade within the game's original design document. In this instance, they were intended to be used for the bomber plane and the bomber plane only, so I figured maybe the devs had been playing around with this idea and that it being a weapon available to pig classes instead could be on the table, just like the shockwave and shock shell in today's game being split between pigs and vehicles. It is entirely possible that this early version of the shockwave was exactly that, a type of concussion-based weaponry that was expanded upon from that idea of the bomber concussion grenade, but ultimately I will leave it for you to decide, so let me know what you think about that one in the comments. Now, it wouldn't be until a year later, in 1999, that the shockwave would actually become the shockwave that we know today. The key thing to note about this weapon is that it never left the arsenal of the Legend whatsoever. It was never given to any other class, so we can near enough assume it has always been capable of some pretty powerful stuff. Up until the end of Hogs' alpha stage of development, the Legend was intended to be a playable class, but through further testing and the implementation of the single player campaign, the Legend was eventually placed out of reach of the player and into just a single level on mission 25. See, when Hogs of War was being developed, up until the beta stage, the overall process was for maps to be created, tested, played, and then eventually added if they were good enough. So up until 1999, the game was entirely multiplayer focused, and that was always the intention, for multiplayer to be the key highlight of Hogs. The single player campaign was somewhat less important and was put together within the final year and a half before the game's release, and it must have been through that testing that the team realized that they needed a certain class to fill the shoes of that final multiplayer boss type of enemy, and that was of course the Legend. The elite pigs would never have worked as multiplayer classes, the Legend especially. Alongside being very overpowered in the majority of situations, the shockwave was actually the cause of a lot of headaches for the Hogs programmers. Throughout development, the shockwave had a tendency to break the game and cause major bugs in a whole bunch of different areas, so much so that when the weapon was eventually brought under control, it had to be banished alongside the legend to that final mission in the single player campaign. Okay, I hear you ask, then why is it that they can be found in those random crates on Square Off? Well, first off, the random crates, the ones that can be collected that have a question mark on them, will always give the chance of providing a shockwave to the player. So basically they are randomized crates. Why is a random crate used specifically on this map and nowhere else in multiplayer? I have no idea, but it could have been a simple mistake made by the devs at the time when the map was put together. If it's intentional, it is just extremely random. And yeah, that is basically a complete look at the rarest weapon in Hogs of War. It's a weapon that needs no introduction. It's a super secret weapon that is made even more appealing by the fact that it is so rare, but that rarity in many ways is warranted. If it were held by any other class, the shockwave would be considered way too powerful, or at least more than it already is. Being able to push pigs in a particular direction over vast distances is just too much power, especially when you consider that 9 times out of 10 it results in that pig being blasted off the map into small pieces of bacon. But do you agree that it's a little bit overpowered? Let me know your thoughts on everything in the comments below. Let's get a discussion going as we always do, and in the meantime I will catch you guys later for the next one.